Happy to welcome you to today's webinar on vendor management. You may be in the cloud, but you still count outsource accountability. I'm going to go through a few pieces of housekeeping first. Next slide. Oop, back one. There we are. Just a reminder that your microphones are automatically muted. If you have any technical difficulty, such as having no sound, please feel free to contact Tim Newcomb through the chat function. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions for the presenters, please type them in the Zoom Q&A function at any time. We may hold questions for the end, but if something really timely comes up, we may break in and ask our presenters to respond at that point in time. So please feel free to ask your questions as they occur to you. There will be a link to a short survey that will be provided at the end of the webinar. Please let us know what you think of the webinar. It's now my pleasure to introduce the host for today's webinar, David Houle from BerryDunn. David has been with BerryDunn Corporation for over 15 years and has worked with over 150 different higher education partners in a full array of services through his organization. And he's done a fabulous job in pulling together today's panel. Barry?
Thank you, Vicki. And hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us and appreciate you making time for us today. So without further ado, let's get into this great session where we've got a lot of very interesting speakers with different experiences that they can pull to bring to the topic of conversation. Introductions are forthcoming. I'll introduce all of our speakers. And then the topics we're going to cover today, just a reminder, are vendor relationships and the power of consortia, followed by technology contracts and strategic planning, and then ending with managing vendor security in the age of outsourcing. And again, we'll, if you do have an urgent question, you can chime in, as Vicki said, but otherwise we're gonna have questions and discussion after the formal remarks. Just a reminder, the expected learning outcomes that we hope to achieve are learning to leverage supplier relationships for cost savings and beyond cost of goods sold. How can the use of key consortia provide stronger vendor management? How institutions can avoid a costly RFP process by using competitive contracts? And how cooperatives can aid institutions in looking at their overall spend and where they can save money? And then finally, tips and practices for how to monitor and track vendors managing critical infrastructure or software. And then, of course, last but not least, we will get into hopefully some good questions and discussion, and we're looking forward to the thoughts that you as the audience bring to the table. So just very quickly about BerryDunn. Most of you know us, I think. I looked at the participants list, but just a quick reminder, we've been in business for 46 plus years. Vicki has mentioned the volume of schools and systems and consortia that we've served. We have 500 plus employees scattered really throughout the nation now. And I think something to remember about us is we're independent and objective consultants, meaning we have no affiliation with any vendors of hardware, software, or other types of suppliers. So we are truly independent and objective in the work we do and the perspective we bring to vendor management as well. So real quick before I hand it off to our first speaker, I thought it'd be good to set the appropriate tone, and that is really about what is vendor management. And I really liked this quote: vendor management is a discipline that enables organizations to control costs, drive service excellence, and mitigate risks to gain increased value from their vendors throughout the deal lifecycle. And that's the source there, Gardner. But I really think that speaks to what we'll be talking about today. And it speaks to the broad framework from which we approach this topic for today's discussion. I did want to say just a quick word. I think it would be awkward not to, acknowledge the world we're living in. So just briefly, I wanted to say about COVID-19, it's disrupted all of our lives, the institutions that you work with, our society in general. And I think it's important to remember at this time that history tells us that we will overcome, this pandemic as we have in past, and it'll improve our ability to help one another, I hope, and hopefully prevent the the next one. But I think it's worth noting also the incredible work our healthcare providers are doing and other folks that are putting themselves in harm's way every day. And I know I appreciate it, and I hope you do. I know you do too. And so let's be thinking about them as we go through our lives as well. So with that said, I want to jump into our presenters. So here we are. I'm on the left there. We've already talked about me. The first speaker up will be Mary. She's a Vice President of Operational Services at Southern New Hampshire University. And then that'll be followed by Keith Folks, who's the Vice President, E&I Cooperative Services and Executive Director of the Higher Education System and Services Consortium, affectionately known as HESS. And then finally, my colleague and coworker, Chris Ellingwood, who's a Senior Manager for IT Assurance Services at BerryDunn, and he will be talking about vendor management tips and practices. So Mary, I'm going to hand it off to you now to kick us off, and thank you again.
Thank you. And thank you, David, for the opportunity to speak with everybody today. I'm going to start with just a little bit of background information about Southern New Hampshire University. You want to bring up the first slide, David? We'll go with the first one. So SNHU is a school that started back in the 1930s as a really small business school in downtown Manchester. And next slide. And we have grown exponentially. So in 1995, we launched our very first online course. And the rest has kind of been history. In 2001, we became Southern New Hampshire University. And as you can see, the growth has just been tremendous. And hopefully you can see some of those statistics that we have up there. So that's just a little bit about Southern New Hampshire University. Let's talk now a little bit more about the power of vendor relationships. How can we leverage them for success in your organization? Well, SNHU has had considerable growth over the years. Much of our operations, particularly our campus operations, are actually really small. And so we really do lean on our suppliers to create efficiencies and cost savings for us. So what does a strong vendor relationship look like? It's really evolved. It's actually an evolution that really goes from just being another supplier to then becoming a more strategic partnership. So it's really an organization it's really a relationship that should move just beyond just unit price. So in other words, how can you work as an entity collaboratively with your supplier towards a value-added relationship? It should also be a win-win relationship. It can't just be one-sided. I always say that the supplier needs to make a profit just as much as we need to save money or get that good deal. So for example, when working with a supplier, I always try to look at how can we become a customer that can help drive down their cost of doing business. So really sitting together and saying, hey, can we do things more electronically, electronic invoicing? Can we do electronic settlements? All these things actually work towards driving down their cost of doing business, which then results in a bottom line, a more positive bottom line, not only for them, but also for us. There also needs to be transparency and trust. I really feel that this is the foundation, and many times this gets overlooked. We really look at the supplier as, that person sitting across the table, not somebody that really should be working with towards achieving our strategic goals. And one of the ways this might look like is actually sitting down with your suppliers, and I've done this in the past, and saying, hey, help us understand what drives your costs, what drives your expenses. Are you willing to open up your books to us? We'll open up, what it is we do. And so that way we can have that mutual trusting relationship to work together toward those common goals. And of course, innovation as well. I think with any supplier, there really needs to be, as part of that trust, also, hey, how can we work together to be creative and innovative to solve the unique problems? I always look at suppliers that are looking to, if you have that strong relationship and they've got new technologies, new processes, things that they want to try, I'll say, hey, let us be your guinea pig. Let us work together with you to really, work to be able to make sure that you and I are being as efficient and as cost effective as possible. Again, that win-win relationship. And of course, continuous improvement, feedback, communication, all that is really critical. There should always be that constant back and forth. We sit down and have quarterly reviews with our suppliers. It never should really be a surprise as to how we're doing. We have KPIs that we track, and we really work together to make sure that we're not only talking about the successes, but also talking about opportunities for improvement. One of the services that's where communication is most critical is when you're working with technology and or cloud suppliers. And the reason I say that is because managing any of these suppliers, particularly those that might be in the cloud, it's really different now than it might have been in the past, because perhaps in the past you had more control of the technology. So it's really important as you sit down with these suppliers that are operating the cloud that you really put together your service level agreements, or SLAs. You want to make sure that you have them set up, and you want to make sure that you're really defining your key metrics to measure success. And you also want to be sure that you're understanding the supplier's roadmap for future enhancements. So that way you know in advance about where they might be going and how that might impact your organization. Again, communication is critical. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples. And these are examples that I think you can take across any industry or any product or service that you might be buying. So the light bulbs example is really just it's really a very simple one. Usually a lot of times we go buy a commodity and we're going and trying to find the best price for something. But what we miss is that total cost of acquisition. So while you might take your light bulb and try to buy it from 3 or 4 suppliers and get the best price either time, what you're missing is, could you work with one supplier where you can get those light bulbs delivered just in time? Maybe you don't have to order, it's on an automatic refill. It's all electronic. There's electronic settlement on the back end as well as the electronic invoicing. Now, buying that light bulb, which might have been 5 or 6 people touching that transaction, and now you've shrunken it down to being something that's actually almost touchless. Another example I have is, and this is a picture of our beautiful parking garage, which is now sitting vacant right now in downtown Manchester. And because of the virus, we unfortunately had to shut it down, but we sat down with our management company and we said, hey, how can we work together? How can we really make sure that we can reduce our costs during this time, but also make sure that we keep a few of our key employees over there employed to make sure that the garage has coverage. The other last example is travel. And I like travel because I know a lot of folks tend to let everybody book their own travel. We were very successful at SNHU at bringing our volume towards one supplier. So when we had to get 12 students home, literally within an hour's notice because of COVID-19, we were able to make one phone call to get those students home. And it really helped the university able to mitigate that risk because of that partnership in place. So my next topic is going to talk a little bit about the power of purchasing consortia. And I just really love this one because when we look at consortia, you want to do the next slide, David? When we look at consortia, there truly is power in numbers. I've been very fortunate over my career to have had experience working with consortia in the Boston area, New Hampshire schools, as well as having the opportunity to be a member of the E&I board of directors. And it really is a passion of mine. The numbers are real. Having always worked at small institutions, it's really the consortia that help me and my organization be successful over the years, because they really become an extension of your department. The best way, I think, to take advantage of consortia is to seek out those that already exist first. So at my institution, E&I is really our go-to when we talk about our large national suppliers. We have the MHEC, which is a New England-based consortium, and we use them for the more regional ones. But then if you want to really attract some of those smaller, very local suppliers, we reach out to the schools next door and say, hey, how can we work together to really come up with some good agreements with some of our smaller local suppliers. Over my career, I really believe that I've saved millions through consortia, but I think more significantly, I've saved dollars on the resources side. So it's allowed me to have a leaner organization when I'm able to utilize the consortias that are already out there. Even at our large size institution, even with over 130,000 learners online right now, we use consortias for a vast majority of the everyday things that we purchase, such as our laptops, travel, background services, shipping services, furniture. The list can go on. I think my advice is the first thing to do anytime you want to do any major purchase, look to the consortias first before you launch that RFP. Save those resources, and even if you think you can do marginally better, you have to ask yourself how much time and effort on your end, and is that worth the investment? So that's what I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That was great. Appreciate it. And again, we'll have questions at the end of the discussion. We have 2 more speakers here. Keith's going to talk about technology contracts and strategic planning. And I even heard Mary mention E&I, which was probably a nice segue into Keith's discussion. So Keith, I'll hand it over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. And thanks, Vicki, for putting this on and making it happen. You can go on to the next slide. So E&I always, I always take for granted that maybe some institutions don't know about E&I. E&I is the largest. Well, you can go on to the next slide, David. I'm having a little lag on my side. Go to what is E&I Cooperative Services slide. So E&I Cooperative Services is the largest member-owned nonprofit purchasing cooperative in the United States. We were founded in 1934. I am the vice president for the technology division. We have several divisions: technology, facilities, scientific, financial, healthcare, lots of different areas. So basically, we have over 5,000 members, 4,500 members now, which really encompasses all of the colleges and universities in the United States, plus a growing number of K-12s. So in general, we do public solicitations for institutions, our member institutions, on behalf of our member institutions so that they don't have to do that. They can use our publicly solicited contracts basically instead of their own. So it saves them lots of time, lots of money, as Mary said. Mary is a wonderful proponent of E&I, does a lot of work with our executive team, in fact. But we've saved our institutions a lot of money over the years, and we do about nearly $3 billion worth of contract use every year. So you can go on to the next. Our technology portfolio, of course, consists of a lot of different. Dave, you can go on to the next slide there.
I did.
Okay. I'm getting a lag here. That's okay.
Okay.
It's just the Zoom life, right? So we have a lot of contracts that we're building right now that have really help our members. A lot of these were partnered with another organization that I helped co-found, and now I'm the executive director for the HES Consortium of private nonprofit schools. So in general, I'm going to talk a little bit about how those contracts, how we partnered with other organizations and how we are partnering with other organizations to make sure that our contracts are the absolute best in the industry. But not only just for procurement standards, but also for technical standards, ADA standards, security standards, those types of things. You can go on to the next, David. So in general, what we've got is, and the other organization that I'm kind of speaking for is the HES Consortium. It was founded in 2014. It has about 187 private nonprofit colleges and universities in the country, all kind of focused on ERP and cloud services. Before I came to E&I, I was a CIO for 25 years before. And so I have a real focus in technology, and specifically in the growing costs of ERP and the continuing cloud services. So that group has partnered with and has an MOU with E&I that the CIOs that are part of that group actually help in the RFP selection, the RFP development, and also the RFP and contract awards. So it's very interesting. They give lots of input, not only with our CFOs, our CIOs that are part of this, but our CPOs. The whole idea with having these partnerships is to pull the CIOs and the CPOs together to work together in a deeper way to find better ways of doing things, to find lots of contracts that basically have interconnecting pieces and parts. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So you can go on to the next. So keys to a collaborative partnership, contract partnerships. For E&I and also for Hess, but for E&I, the key is member involvement. Easily, it is the largest aspect of our RFPs and our selections for contracts, cooperative contracts. All of our RFP teams are personed by CPOs and CIOs in the technology area, but also in the other areas, specific thought leaders are a part of these groups. And so it's extremely important across the board for our members because we're a member-owned cooperative, it's very important that our members are involved. So in addition to that, and possibly the most important part that I want to hammer home is something that Mary's already talked about. There is strength in numbers. We have E&I, we're a nonprofit, we are member owned, and we act on behalf of our members. So basically, the more loyalty and the more work that our members do through E&I, the better negotiation positioning E&I has with our vendors and our suppliers. So it's their cooperative, and how that power affects, pricing and terms and conditions are the reason why they're a part of us. And we are even now in this time, trying to hammer home those points even harder now with our contracts. So consistent contact, I would say that one of the major things that is a benefit to working with consortia and specifically for E&I is it takes time to manage contracts. It takes time to consistently manage those relationships, developing and enhancing those contracts to get better over time, and also honing the pricing on behalf of our members. And so that takes time. It takes effort. It takes expertise. And on most of our campuses have the expertise to do it, but they don't have the time. And so what we do is we work with our members and work with specifically our vendors and our suppliers to hone those things in our contracts. The partnerships with others are very, very important, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Go on to the next slide, David. We have what is called now the E&I National Coalition on Enterprise Systems and Services within the technology division. We have 23 of the top national CIOs and CPOs on that group. And what we're talking about, broad discussions about industry reform and ERP and computer purchases and buying and other aspects of the procurement life cycle. They also give us a direction and input in what is important in our contracts. Very important to our members is now an evolving standards document for all cloud contracts to make sure that they are not only technically superior, but also superior in areas of security, of ADA compliance, of FERPA and HIPAA regulations, of all those things that are wrapped up, data data privacy, data security in store, at rest, and in transit. So those are very, very important parts to the overall picture. You can go on down to the next one, David. So one of these partnerships, in addition to the others that we talked about, is a partnership with Internet2 that we have created. We have a new pilot project that's going on with a new RFP and solicitation for cloud telecommunications and web conferencing. And Internet2 has helped us with the technology standards, but it is still on E&I paper, so it is an E&I contract usable for our procurement community. So if you've ever tried to use an Internet2 contract, sometimes there can be challenges in the way that they have they've tried to do solicitations there. We're taking that out of the mix, and Internet2 is working with us to make better contracts and in general better technology standards for those. Going to the next one. And I'll do these quickly because I should have spent most of the time on this slide. So David, you hold up your fingers if I'm late on my slides. Keys to contract and agreements. Contracts, what are you looking for? You're looking for the right products at the right price, correct? And so what our contracts do as a cooperative is we have a larger spend potential than just one institution. So the larger spend when we represent a larger spend, we can actually leverage that larger spend potential in terms of cost savings. I think one of the major pieces to the E&I contract are that we meet a high quality standard on our national public and private procurement standards. It's NIGP standards that people look for in the procurement community, and they're very usable contracts. They're all competitively solicited, or they have been adopted by institutions, lead public agencies that had done a competitive solicitation. They're closely managed, thoroughly researched. We have an incredible analytics team at E&I that thoroughly researches the industry, and also we share the benefits. So basically, our members get most years, because we're a nonprofit, we can only hold a certain amount of revenue through our contract administration fees, which are small, but we give back to our members on in what we call a patronage payback to our members based on how much they've used our contracts. So that's what I have.
Thank you, Keith, for that. And hopefully the lag isn't too bad. It may be on my end too, so I apologize if folks are seeing that. I'm not seeing it as we move through the slides, but I guess some folks are. Chris, last but definitely not least, managing vendor security in the age of outsourcing. My colleague, Chris Ellingwood.
Great, thank you, Dave, and thank you, Keith and Mary, for setting us up. A couple things that both Mary and Keith said that I'll drive some of the point home here with my slides is, Mary had mentioned, a key part of what they do is they establish service level agreements with vendors, especially IT vendors, and establishing those at time of contract is your opportunity to negotiate your expectations and to make crystal clear to your vendors what those expectations are. And then Keith had mentioned that he is also doing that through bulk buying, and they're managing contracts. And what they both will end up resulting in is the need for continuous and ongoing monitoring at your specific organizational level. No matter where the contract lives and who has a contract, it is the individual organization's responsibility to manage their own risk. And as we rely more and more, and quite frankly, very critically on have reliance on third parties, we need to make sure that we understand what they're doing, how they're doing it, and that they're achieving our expectations that we've documented in our contracts and SLAs. Uh, in the world that I work in, I often hear, I'd say not often, nearly every engagement I'm on where I look at third-party risk, I hear it's not in the contract. And we work with organizations to encourage them that there is more to just a contract as part of vendor management. And it comes down to risk mitigation and risk management. And we'll talk a little bit through this on how, and areas and suggestions on how to do that. I think as we, in the current environment of which we're working, as we're all here on a Zoom session from our homes and wherever we are, we're using these software as a service providers every day. Zoom is a software as a service provider. Our ERP systems, our remote access systems. Historically, 10 years plus ago, these were all hosted by a little data center at every campus or university. And over the years, the vendors have realized it's much easier to manage systems, keep you on the current version, and to protect your data by having centralized software as service data centers. So they're hosting applications where you have your own unique instance. And while you're doing that, it's still your data, but you're relying on that vendor. So again, we need to make sure we're managing that contract. And I do talk about IT risk, but everything, as you know, is technology based. So all vendors, not just your Zoom and your ERP providers, are a risk. The Target hack, the massive data breach that cost them millions and millions of dollars and made every newspaper headline in the country, was actually the fault of a HVAC, heating and ventilation air conditioning company that managed their coolers, and they had a remote connection to Target, and that's how the hackers ended up leveraging their systems and stealing data. And Target actually wasn't aware that they had that connection. So again, they didn't have that, they didn't achieve their end of the responsibility of understanding that level of risk. Dave, you can keep us going. I think the first bullet on this slide again is incredibly critical again with today's environment. We had a nor'easter here in Maine on Monday, and our internet was glitchy, and it was an incredibly unproductive day. So we are so reliant on our vendors being available for us to use them and their services. And as these services are pushed more into the cloud, we need to make sure that we can access their systems. We often hear that, yes, we have 99.99% availability promised as part of software hosted companies. If you read the contract, what that actually tells you is that, yes, we are 99.99% available at our data center and wherever that data center is. That does not mean that you at home will be able to access your server 99.99% of the time. So it sounds great, but you need to understand what that means and plan for it. A lot of our end users and folks that were using, systems like Zoom, and when you log in, it's labeled as a BerryDunn Zoom. It looks like it is a company or organizational system, but it's hosted. So your end users might not actually know there's a third party, and again, you need to be aware of that perception and that risk to you. Financial risk is just as important as IT security risk. I worked with a major university just 6 months ago that implemented a single sign-on system, centrally hosted at a remote data center. Took them 2.5 years to implement the system, got everyone up and loaded, and they went bankrupt overnight and shut down. Not looking at their financial statements, no one reviewed them and saw the red flags. There were going concerns and other issues. So making sure that you're doing proper due diligence at time of onboarding and on a regular basis might help you reduce that risk. Compliance risk of vendors is critical, especially as we have student PII, faculty PII, financial information. Universities are a goldmine of data, and we need to make sure that our vendors are securing that data and are compliant with regulatory standards. And it's our job to request that evidence on a yearly basis, not just at the time of the contract, and ask for the actual audit reports, because they may have a significant finding that, yes, they passed and they show as compliant, in air quotes, but there were some gaps that we should consider as risk to our organization. And recovery and backup risk, we've seen this a few times where a contract ended or an organization went closed their doors. There was nothing in the contract about who owns that data. So making sure that you are properly backing up data and getting copies of it at your level, because if that contract ends, where does that data go? Who owns it? Do you have a right to go and get a copy of it? You need to understand those from a business continuity perspective. All right, Dave. So I mentioned this is critical to monitoring. These are some headlines, but 1, 2, 3, 4 of the, or 3 of these, I should say, are from best practice organizations, indicating either that 25% of higher ed institutions, only 25% are self-admittedly monitoring third parties for information security risk. In the Verizon report, higher education in general are the in the top 10 of most targeted industries, and some other things about how hackers they love higher ed organizations. You have research data, personal data, health data. It's all there and it's in one spot. It's a great spot to start, and understanding how third parties are protecting that is just so important. All right, Dave. So who exactly is responsible? Again, we get this, it's the contracting department, it's contracts, it's contract management. That's true in a normal sense, but there's also needs to be some other roles assigned. Third parties need an assigned business owner at the university level who are responsible for managing the contract, staying in communication with the vendor, and on an annual basis conducting the annual due diligence, which I'll dig into in our next slide here. And that should be separate from a contract coordination point of view. Might be tied in the same department, but the same person can't do both, as Keith mentioned, time-wise or resource-wise. It needs to be split up somehow. One person just couldn't possibly do that, especially with some of the universities. I just was at a university before we were sent home here to work from home, doing an on-site audit. They had 28,000 high-risk vendors, not to mention the other 178,000 vendors that they worked with. So there's a lot of vendors here, and understanding how we can monitor them at a size that level is also important. All right, Dave? And so what exactly is a complete vendor management program? This is, I will self-admit here, a vastly simplified infographic of what a vendor management program looks like. And this is taken from a 8-hour workshop that I have done with some universities on vendor management. So I will not talk to you for 8 hours on this. And I'll just talk you through the steps quickly here. The first step, identifying who your third parties are, sounds simple. As I made a note here, this is incredibly difficult in higher ed organizations. You have cross departments, different colleges, some central functions, some central with some support from college functions. I guarantee this is going to be much harder than you think to gather an inventory of your vendors that you have confidence that it is a complete list. Risk is important here. You know, the folks that water and put mulch down on your landscape at your university are probably not considered high security risk versus your ERP and your learning management system providers. So identifying where the risk is and what those impacts are helps you scope down for due diligence. Once you do that, based off of your risk, you conduct annual due diligence procedures based on that, again, that level of risk. High risk, that means you're looking at financial audits yearly. You're asking for IT audit, SOC reports, and compliance audits. And if your vendor says, oh, we don't have any of that, we highly recommend on an annual basis for your critical and high-risk vendors, leveraging the EDUCAUSE HVIC IT questionnaire, which many vendors are aware of. They may have actually already completed it for you. I promise you, vendors grumble at getting these because every customer is starting to ask for them. So if we can come up with a way to ask them for something they've done, I believe, and I promise you, they appreciate it more than say, no, you have to use the questions that I wrote for you. So using third parties that have looked into this, I highly recommend. And then we encourage reports to boards and senior management on your high-risk vendors and what that risk is to the organization, and the impact and cost, so that senior management is aware just exactly of how much an organization is relying on vendors. I think senior management would be rather surprised in many cases at the level of risk that is out there as we sign more contracts. And I think that is it for my slides, Dave. So I'll let you wrap us up.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. And thank you to Mary, Keith, and Chris for, I think, really giving what I had hoped would be the perspective, which is very different perspectives, but they all have similar tiebacks to vendor management. And I'm just going to give the audience a quick synopsis as you formulate your questions. I think what we heard was SLAs, vendor partnerships, understanding roadmaps of SaaS providers. Don't just assume that they're going to continue to create new functionality that meets your needs. You really need to be proactive in engaging with those SaaS vendors. The power of volume, but like-minded volume, meaning consortia that are like you. It's easier to work within those groups than it is just being in some group purchasing, which you're serving higher ed, and another group is serving transportation or manufacturing. But again, I think that like-minded consortia is valuable to consider. Contracts, don't start them from scratch if you don't have to. I mean, again, E&I is a 80-plus-year-old almost organization. Contracts don't have to start from scratch. Leverage the work that's come before you and thinking about that. And then finally, remember that just because you outsource it doesn't mean you can ignore. And I think that's the key theme throughout this. Vendor management is ongoing. And as Chris pointed out, identify vendors, quantify risk, monitor vendors, and have some type of output annually to the board, some type of vendor management, so that it keeps everyone accountable as you look at the vendor landscape. So with that said, I'm going to open it up to questions.
All right, David, we have a question from for Mary from Amy Cronin, asking if she can specify some of the purchasing consortia that Southern New Hampshire has worked with other than E&I and Hess.
Great.
Sure. Yeah, happy to answer that question. So we do. So to be honest, E&I is probably our number one in terms of our volume. The other consortium, we use the Boston Consortium. We use them for their travel contracts. There's also the MHEC. The MHEC it used to be Massachusetts based. It's now for New England. It stands for the Mass Higher Ed Consortium, but they call themselves MHEC now. And they've got, again, a lot of New England based. They do have a few national contracts, but they're also very good. And then we use some of them like NERComp. We've used them for some of their software agreements. But those are primarily the ones I would say. It's the E&I, MHEC, the Boston Consortium that we end up utilizing the most.
Great. Okay.
All right, I have a question actually myself for Chris. I can't type it in since I'm a panelist. Chris, you said that your very first step in your infographic was identifying, and that this is actually the biggest stumbling block in terms of where things can start to go wrong. What are some of the most common hurdles people encounter when they're trying to identify those vendors?
Great, thank you, Vicky. So the question you're asking is, what's the common hurdle as we begin to identify vendors? And from my experience, where we get that is the larger the university, the higher the requirement is for having a formal RFP and contract in place on a value. And as we move through, timelines and around 2020, technology is a lot less expensive than it used to be. So we're seeing that professors, faculty, department heads have, between a $5,000 and $10,000 purchase max before they have to go through procurement and the right channels. And they're using credit cards and signing up for third-party services, data share. We see that probably the most common is folks signing up for like a share file type service so they can send files securely without doing any vetting on them. And I'd say that's where the biggest risk of having an IT type vendor that's undetected in places.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
if I can, Chris, if I can just add to that, since we work in obviously similar capacities, that the other, one of the other challenges in higher ed in particular, of course, is grant funding, which gives a lot of autonomy. I mean, there is just so much diffusion of authority in the higher ed setting that it makes it that much more difficult to identify and keep track of vendors, because professors are supposed to go after grant funding. That's part of what many of them are, that's why they're there. So there's just so many different moving parts. And of course, as you say, Chris, the bigger the institution, the more complexities that it introduces when you introduce that research capacity too. But
Great. We have another question. Dave mentioned that it's important to select a group that's like your consortium. Can you identify purchasing and service consortia that do a particularly good job with smaller schools?
Since my name was mentioned, I'm going to actually see if Keith wants to answer that. I think that might be better suited for him. But
Yeah. So of course, the HES Consortium has an MOU directly with E&I. So a lot of our contracts, all of our contracts are done through E&I. We do have lots and lots of discount. If you're talking about technology, we have discount partners that are partners with HES that help small colleges, especially in the technology operations. But BerryDunn is one of our partners with the HES Consortium. We've got partnerships with lots of ERP companies. Ellucian, we're under contract with Workday, Oracle through Mythics, and Unit 4. D2L is another one that we have a great contract with, and we work very closely with them. But we have discount partners, with lots and lots of different organizations, companies. You can see this in the member benefits at www.hesconsortium.org, and you can get a listing of those. In terms of other, consortia, it all depends on the area. I believe, HES is the only, for private schools, as you mentioned, HES is the only consortium out there that really focuses on ERP and cloud services specifically. But E&I is really the fount of most of those. There's other organizations like, as Mary mentioned, NERComp and some others, but I'm going to say they're limited in what they offer. But I don't know if that answered the question, Vicki or David.
Hey, does anybody mind if I can quickly?
Yeah, no, I was going to turn to you, Mary, for some additional. I know you've mentioned
jump in
MHAC.
here.
Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, I mean, so I know that I'm going to sound like an E&I commercial, but I actually, in my position on the board, my role was to represent small schools. So I have always worked. I've only been at SNHU for about 5 years now, and the other schools that I've worked at have always worked at small private schools in the Boston area. And you know, E&I really just does do a great job in focusing not on the large schools, but they actually do have a very strong interest in helping the smaller schools. And the nice thing about their model is they have these member service representatives that are out there that can come and talk to you and explain all the contracts. So they really do a great job. You know, if I'm not sure where the question is coming from or where you are in what area of the country, but if or you know what state you might be from, but if you want to reach out and reach out to me separately, if you are from the New England area, I'm happy to talk to you about some of the other more local consortiums. But I think E&I just really does have a great focus on smaller schools. They're not just for the big ones that are out there.
Thanks, Mary. We appreciate that. You know, our outgoing CEO was really vocal. You know, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, when I came in, saying we don't do enough for the small privates, mid-sized private schools that really need our help. And so there's been a massive engagement with the private institutions with E&I, and out of that came the MOU and the close partnership with HES. And we also have a good partnership with the Coalition for College Cost Savings, which is actually an organization that was kind of founded by the private college associations, the state associations, which we're very close with also, both with E&I and with HES.
Yeah, that's yeah, the acronym is CCCS, Coalition for College Cost Savings, that Keith mentioned. Yeah, I just want to throw in, I hope nobody thinks this is a shill for E&I. That was not the intent at all. I think, you know, for the audience out there, obviously you're dealing with an organization that's been around since 1934 and proven itself. So we're not ashamed to talk about it. Also, there are regional groups, and I think the point is there's lots of avenues for looking at purchasing power and not going it alone. I think that should be one of the key takeaways if you haven't realized that yet. One of the there was a chat comment here to the panelists. Do you use GovQuote/GovSpend? That's probably maybe more for Mary, since you're the institution on the panel.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar. Amy, I'd be interested to understanding more about who they are. So we're private, and so while we are able to get the state of New Hampshire, we are able to take advantage of some of their state contracts. But I don't know if just because it says GovQuote or GovSpend, I don't know if that's for
Yeah.
institutions or not.
E&I uses GovSpend, believe it or not, in our analytics. So they are very, very helpful, giving, they basically give a lot of good analytic input into developing our RFPs and researching the product market for certain RFPs, even down to, you know, giving some insight into how much spend is out there in that market. So it's very actually, and some glimpses into what's the standard, what are the standard pricing structures that are out there. So it's actually, they're very helpful. We're a partner with them.
Yeah, Amy Cronin was the one that sent that question out to the group, and she commented that schools, the schools that she works with, which is the New York 6 in upstate New York, they're all private, but they can access federal contracts as well. And how I got to know Mary was by working with the New Hampshire College and University Council, which represents all the colleges and universities in the state of New Hampshire, except Dartmouth, I guess, but regardless of them. And one of the things that we've done is actually create an agreement between the university system of New Hampshire that allows all of the institutions, whether you're public or private, to take advantage of their contracts as well. And that was probably already out there, but now it's more formalized. And so that's one of the things we've been working on with NHCUC. And so again, just because you're private, don't think that you can't tap into some of these public vehicles as well. I think that's a fallacy. At least it's worth investigating. Sorry, Mary. I cut you off.
I will have to be checking it out. Thank you.
There have been a couple of posts in the chat with links to GovQuote and to GovSpend. So
Great. All right. Anything else? Got a couple more minutes here. I know we started a little bit late, so Tim was going to give us a couple more minutes if we needed it. We have an active. Okay. Vicky, did you want me to turn it back over to you?
Sure, if you can. And if you could actually, or just advance it one slide, there we go. This is just a reminder that we need your feedback on our webinars. The committee takes your feedback and uses this to help build improvements in all of our offerings to the ACL membership. You'll also find a link to the survey in the chat, so you can actually link on it directly in the chat, or the link will be sent to you as a follow-up with a copy of the link to the recording of this webinar. But we want to thank the panelists, and thank you, Dave, for bringing together such a terrifically talented group of panelists, and a very, very rich offering on vendor management and vendor relations, as well as those higher ethical and accountability issues that our consortia need to think about